The morning fog hung thick over London as Queen Camilla stepped quietly from the back entrance of Clarence House. Her usual confident stride was replaced by hurried, nervous steps. The woman who normally commanded attention with her regal presence now pulled a simple wool coat tighter around her shoulders, trying to blend into the shadows of the early dawn. For weeks, Camilla had been planning this moment. The weight of royal duties, the constant scrutiny, and the mounting pressure from recent controversies had become unbearable. She needed space to breathe, to think, to remember who she was before the crown changed everything. The decision to leave, even temporarily, hadn't come easily. Her personal assistant, Margaret, had been sworn to secrecy. Only she knew about the small cottage in the Scottish Highlands that Camilla had purchased years ago under a different name. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could shed the royal facade and simply exist as a woman, trying to make sense of her complicated life. The black sedan waiting in the alley wasn't the usual royal vehicle. Instead, it was an ordinary car that Margaret had arranged, driven by a trusted friend who asked no questions. Camilla slipped into the back seat, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She hadn't felt this alive in months. As the car pulled away from the familiar streets of London, Camilla clutched two small bags in her lap. These weren't the expensive designer handbags she usually carried to public events. These were old, worn leather bags that held items far more precious than any royal jewelry or official documents. The first bag contained letters, hundreds of them. Some were yellowed with age, others more recent. These were letters from her children from her first marriage, written during the difficult years when the public scrutinized every aspect of her relationship with Charles. There were also letters from her late father, filled with advice about love, duty, and staying true to oneself despite what others might say. Mixed among the family correspondence were letters from ordinary people, strangers who had written to thank her for various charitable works, mothers who had lost children and found comfort in her words, elderly people who felt forgotten by society until she visited their care homes. These letters had sustained her through the darkest periods of public criticism. The second bag held photographs that the public had never seen. Pictures of her as a young woman, laughing freely without the burden of royal protocol. Images of quiet family moments, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, lazy Sunday afternoons, before her life became front-page news around the world. There was also a small, leather-bound journal that she had kept sporadically over the years. In it, she had poured out her fears, her hopes, her struggles with finding her place in an institution that seemed determined to reshape her into something she wasn't sure she could become. As the car moved through the quiet streets, Camilla allowed herself to remember the woman she used to be. She thought about her passion for literature, her love of gardening, her simple pleasure in cooking for friends. These parts of herself had been slowly buried under layers of royal expectations and public scrutiny. The driver, following Margaret's instructions, took a circuitous route out of London. They passed through small villages where life moved at a gentler pace, where people weren't constantly watching and judging. Camilla pressed her face to the window, watching ordinary people going about their morning routines, walking dogs, collecting newspapers, tending to their gardens. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace beginning to settle over her. The constant anxiety that had become her companion was starting to ease. She wasn't running away forever, she told herself. She just needed time to rediscover the parts of herself that had gotten lost in the transformation from private citizen to public figure. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who had once been criticized for breaking up a fairy tale marriage, was now desperately trying to save her own sense of self within the very institution she had fought to join. The crown that she had worked so hard to earn had become both a blessing and a burden. As they reached the outskirts of London, Camilla opened the first bag and pulled out one of her father's letters. His familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes. He had written it shortly before his death, when the pressure of her relationship with Charles was at its peak. His words were simple but profound. Remember, my dear, that titles and positions are temporary things. The person you are inside is permanent. Don't let them change the heart I raised. She had read these words countless times, but today they felt particularly relevant. She was embarking on this journey not to escape her responsibilities, but to reconnect with the woman who could handle them with grace and authenticity. The car continued north, carrying her toward what she hoped would be a chance at rediscovering herself. She had no idea that within hours her carefully planned escape would be discovered, setting off a chain of events that would reveal more about her character than any official royal biography ever could. In her bags were the treasures of a lifetime, not gold or jewels, but the memories, relationships, and experiences that had shaped her into the complex woman she had become. Soon the world would see these intimate glimpses into her humanity, and perhaps finally understand that beneath the royal title was simply a woman trying to navigate an extraordinary life with ordinary emotions. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the fog as they left London behind, carrying Camilla toward an uncertain future and a reckoning with her own identity that she never could have anticipated. The Royal Protection Squad discovered Camilla's absence during the routine morning security check at 8:30. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins had been assigned to the Queen's detail for 3 years and had never encountered anything like this. The usually punctual monarch was nowhere to be found, and her private quarters showed clear signs of hasty departure. Panic spread quickly through the palace corridors. Phone calls were made to every possible location where Camilla might have gone: her children's homes, trusted friends' houses, favorite shops, and charitable organizations she supported. Each call returned the same answer. No one had seen or heard from the Queen. King Charles was in Scotland attending to official duties and wouldn't be informed immediately. The palace protocol demanded that every possible explanation be explored before alarming the monarch. Perhaps she had stepped out for an impromptu visit somewhere. Perhaps there had been a miscommunication about her schedule. These hopeful theories were quickly dismissed as the hours passed without contact. Meanwhile, Camilla's car had made good progress north. She sat quietly in the back seat, watching the familiar English countryside roll past the windows. Fields of sheep, old stone churches, and small market towns created a peaceful backdrop for her thoughts. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about public appearances, charitable obligations, or media scrutiny. The driver, James, was a friend of Margaret's from university, who now worked as a freelance journalist. He had agreed to help without asking too many questions, understanding only that someone needed to travel discreetly to Scotland. He respected his passenger's obvious need for privacy and kept conversation to a minimum. As they stopped for fuel at a service station outside Birmingham, Camilla kept her head down and hood up. She purchased a simple sandwich and tea, interactions that reminded her of simpler times when she could move through the world without recognition. The teenage cashier was more interested in her phone than the customer in front of her, and Camilla found this anonymity refreshing. Back in London, Detective Inspector Collins was piecing together the timeline of Camilla's disappearance. CCTV footage from the street cameras around Clarence House showed the unusual activity in the alley behind the building. A car that didn't match any official vehicles had been recorded picking up a figure in dark clothing around 6:15 that morning. The license plate led them to James Morrison, a freelance journalist with no obvious connections to the royal family. This discovery sent alarm bells ringing throughout the security establishment. Had the Queen been kidnapped? Was this some elaborate scheme by a member of the media? The investigation shifted into high gear. Collins coordinated with police forces across the country to track the vehicle's movement. Traffic cameras and automatic number plate recognition systems began building a picture of the car's northward journey. What they couldn't understand was why there had been no ransom demands, no communication from kidnappers, no evidence of struggle. As afternoon approached, Camilla's car was making its way through the Lake District. She had lowered her window slightly and was breathing in the clean mountain air. The stress lines that had become permanent fixtures on her face were beginning to soften. She pulled out her phone to check for messages, then thought better of it and turned the device off completely. The cottage that was their destination held special memories for Camilla. She had discovered it during a particularly difficult period in her relationship with Charles, when public opinion seemed overwhelmingly against her. She had needed a place to retreat, to heal, to remember who she was beyond the newspaper headlines and cruel caricatures. The purchase had been handled discreetly through lawyers, with the property registered under her maiden name. It was a simple stone cottage with a garden that had run wild, exactly the kind of place where she could dig in the soil with her own hands and remember the simple pleasures that had always grounded her. In her bags, Carefully wrapped in silk scarves were packets of seeds she had been saving for this trip, heirloom varieties of flowers that her grandmother had grown, vegetables that reminded her of childhood summers spent in the countryside. She planned to spend her time here creating something beautiful with her own hands, away from the formal palace gardens that were maintained by teams of professional staff. Back in London, the investigation was intensifying. James Morrison's background was being thoroughly examined. His journalism career, his financial situation, his personal relationships, everything was being scrutinized for clues about possible motives. When it was discovered that he had written several articles critical of media treatment of the royal family, investigators wondered if this was connected to his involvement in the Queen's disappearance. Collins made the difficult decision to contact Margaret, Camilla's personal assistant. The woman's initial denials were unconvincing, and under gentle pressure she finally admitted her role in arranging the transportation. Her explanation that the Queen simply needed time alone was met with skepticism by security officials who couldn't understand how someone in Camilla's position could simply walk away from her responsibilities. Margaret's revelation that Camilla owned property in Scotland under a different name sent investigators in a new direction. Property records were being examined, and police forces in Scotland were being alerted to watch for the missing vehicle. As evening approached, Camilla's car was winding through the Scottish Highlands. The dramatic landscape of mountains and lochs had always moved her deeply. This was where she felt most connected to something larger than the institutional pressures of royal life. Here she could remember that she was part of a larger natural world that had existed long before, crowns and protocols, and would continue long after they were forgotten. She thought about the letters in her bag from people who had found comfort in her charitable work. Their struggles with loss, illness, and hardship put her own difficulties into perspective. She had a responsibility to these people, she knew, but she also had a responsibility to herself to remain authentic in how she served them. The cottage was still several hours away, but already Camilla could feel the healing power of this landscape working on her spirit. She had no idea that by now her absence had been discovered, that a nationwide search was underway, that her simple need for solitude was being interpreted as something far more dramatic and potentially dangerous. All she knew was that for the first time in months she felt like herself again. By evening, news of the Queen's disappearance had reached the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister was briefed in a secure call while attending a dinner in Brussels. Emergency protocols that had been designed for terrorist threats or serious security breaches were quietly activated. The Royal Protection Unit worked with counter-terrorism specialists to analyze every possible scenario. Detective Inspector Collins found herself at the center of the most significant royal security incident in decades. The pressure was immense. The Queen of England was missing, and every hour that passed without contact increased the possibility that something terrible had happened. The discovery that Camilla had apparently left voluntarily with a journalist only complicated matters further. The tracking of James Morrison's vehicle had led them to the Scottish border. Local police were coordinating roadblocks and conducting searches of areas where the car might have stopped. Helicopter units with thermal imaging equipment were on standby, ready to search the vast highland wilderness if necessary. Meanwhile, Camilla's car was navigating the narrow roads that led to her cottage. As darkness fell, she could see lights scattered across the valley below, small farms and villages that represented a way of life far removed from the grandeur and complexity of royal existence. These were people who lived by different rhythms, whose concerns were seasonal and immediate rather than political and global. James had been growing increasingly nervous as the day progressed. His initial willingness to help what he thought was a simple transportation request had given way to anxiety, as he realized the magnitude of what they were doing. The Queen of England was in his car and no one in authority knew where she was. His journalistic instincts told him this was a story that could define his career, but his human instincts warned him that he was in far deeper than he had intended. "Are you certain this is what you want to do?" he asked as they turned onto the final approach to the cottage. "There must be people worried about you by now." Camilla looked up from the photograph she had been studying, a picture of herself as a young woman, laughing in a garden with dirt under her fingernails and joy in her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. "But sometimes you have to disappoint people in small ways to avoid disappointing them in larger ways." I need to remember who I am so I can be better at who I'm supposed to be. The cottage appeared around a bend in the road, exactly as she remembered it. Stone walls covered with ivy, a garden that had grown wild and beautiful in her absence, windows that reflected the last light of the Scottish evening. It was a place where she could simply exist without performance or pretense. As James helped her carry her bags to the front door, Camilla felt a profound sense of homecoming. This wasn't where she had grown up, but it was where she had learned to heal, to think, to reconnect with the parts of herself that royal life seemed determined to suppress. Back in London, King Charles had been contacted in Scotland. The news that his wife was missing sent shockwaves through his own security detail. He immediately began making arrangements to return to London, but was advised by security officials to remain where he was until more information became available. The possibility that this was a coordinated attack requiring multiple royal family members to be secured couldn't be ruled out. The media hadn't been informed yet, but palace officials knew that secret couldn't be kept much longer. Plans were being made for various scenarios, from ransom demands to more tragic possibilities. The royal communications team was preparing statements for different outcomes, none of them good. Margaret, Camilla's assistant, was being questioned more intensively now. Her initial cooperation had helped investigators understand the basic facts, but they needed more details about Camilla's state of mind, her recent behavior, any signs that might explain this unprecedented action. "She's been struggling," Margaret admitted to Detective Inspector Collins. "The constant criticism, the pressure to be perfect, the way every gesture gets analyzed and judged. She's a strong woman, but everyone has limits. She just needed space to breathe." This explanation satisfied the human curiosity about motives, but it did nothing to address the security implications. The Queen couldn't simply disappear, regardless of her emotional state. Too many people depended on the stability and predictability of the monarchy. Her absence created vulnerabilities that enemies of the state might exploit. At the cottage, Camilla was experiencing the first peaceful moments she had known in months. She had lit a fire in the old stone fireplace and was sitting in a worn armchair, sorting through the contents of her bags. Each item told a story, represented a relationship or experience that had shaped her journey. She unfolded a letter from a woman in Manchester whose son had died in Afghanistan. The mother had written to thank Camilla for attending the memorial service, for the personal conversation they had shared afterward, for caring about her grief when the rest of the world had moved on to other news. Reading it again, Camilla remembered why her public role mattered even when it felt overwhelming. Another letter was from her own son, written during the worst period of media attacks on her character. His words of support and understanding had kept her going through some very dark days. He had reminded her that strength sometimes meant enduring criticism with grace, and that defending herself against every attack would only create more ammunition for her critics. James had departed after ensuring she was safely inside, leaving her with his phone number and strict instructions to call if she needed anything. He was heading back to London with mixed feelings about his role in the day's events. Part of him understood her need for solitude, but another part worried about the consequences they might both face. As the night deepened, Camilla made herself a simple meal from supplies she kept at the cottage. The act of cooking for herself, of sitting at a small table without staff or protocols, felt revolutionary after months of formal dining with precise schedules and elaborate presentations. She opened her journal and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush as months of suppressed thoughts and feelings found expression. She wrote about the loneliness of being constantly observed, about the challenge of maintaining authenticity while fulfilling an institutional role, about her love for Charles and her struggle to find her place in his ancient family legacy. Outside, the Highland night was alive with sounds that city dwellers rarely heard. Owls calling across the valley, wind moving through pine trees, the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. These natural rhythms reminded her that human concerns, even royal ones, were small parts of a much larger story. In London, the search was intensifying. Police forces across Scotland were being coordinated in a systematic sweep of areas where the tracked vehicle might have gone. The investigation had become a race against time, driven by fears that grew more serious with each passing hour. None of the searchers could have imagined that their quarry was sitting peacefully by a fire, reading old letters and rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under layers of duty and expectation. Dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands with breathtaking beauty. Camilla woke naturally for the first time in months without alarms or schedules dictating her movements. She had slept deeply in the cottage's small bedroom, wrapped in quilts her grandmother had made, surrounded by silence broken only by bird song and the gentle sound of wind through the trees. As she made herself tea and toast, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The simple act of preparing her own breakfast, of moving through morning routines at her own pace, reminded her of fundamental pleasures that royal life had complicated beyond recognition. In London, the search had continued through the night. Detective Inspector Collins had worked without sleep, coordinating with Scottish authorities and analyzing every piece of available evidence. The tracking of James Morrison's vehicle had led them to a general area in the Highlands, but the vastness of the landscape made finding one small cottage seem nearly impossible. King Charles had returned to London in the early hours of the morning, his face drawn with worry and confusion. The man who had waited decades to inherit the throne was now facing the possibility that his wife had simply walked away from everything they had built together. Palace officials briefed him on the investigation's progress, but their updates only deepened his concern. She wouldn't just leave, he insisted to the security team. Not without explanation. Something else is happening here. His certainty that Camilla had been taken against her will conflicted with the evidence that she had planned her departure. Margaret's testimony about the Queen's emotional state wasn't something Charles wanted to accept. In his mind, they had weathered the storms of public criticism together and emerged stronger. The idea that she might need escape from their shared life was almost incomprehensible to him. At the cottage, Camilla was doing something she hadn't done in years, gardening with her own hands. She had found old tools in the shed and was working to clear weeds from flower beds that had been neglected during her absence. The physical labor felt therapeutic, connecting her to the earth in a way that formal palace garden tours never could. As she worked, she thought about the letters in her bag from people who had found strength in her example. Many of them were dealing with challenges far greater than her own: illness, poverty, loss of loved ones, struggles that made her complaints about media attention seem trivial by comparison. Yet their words of gratitude for her public service had sustained her through difficult periods. One letter that particularly moved her was from an elderly woman in Wales who had written after Camilla visited her nursing home. The woman described feeling invisible and forgotten until the Queen's visit reminded her that her life still had value and meaning. That letter had arrived during a week when newspapers were particularly cruel in their coverage of Camilla's fashion choices and public appearances. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to escape the burden of public service, she was rediscovering why that service mattered. The people who wrote to her weren't interested in her struggles with protocol or media relations. They were grateful for moments of human connection, for evidence that someone in a position of privilege cared about their experiences. Back in London, the media were beginning to ask questions. Palace correspondents who had noticed unusual activity around security briefings were making discreet inquiries. So far, official responses were limited to no comment and deflections about the Queen's private schedule. But experienced journalists could sense that something significant was happening. Detective Inspector Collins was facing increasing pressure to expand the search parameters. Military resources were being considered: helicopters with advanced scanning equipment, search teams with specialized training for highland terrain. The operation was becoming larger and more complex with each passing hour. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. James Morrison, consumed by guilt about his role in the situation, contacted police voluntarily. His conscience had overcome his journalistic instincts, and he provided detailed information about their destination. Within hours, local police were approaching the cottage area. Camilla was in her garden when she heard the helicopter. The distant sound grew louder, and she looked up to see the aircraft circling the valley. Her heart sank as she realized her peaceful retreat was coming to an end. She had known this moment would arrive, but she had hoped for more time to complete the internal work she had come here to do. She walked slowly back to the cottage, her hands still dirty from gardening, and sat down to wait. There was no point in running or hiding. She had never intended this to be a permanent escape, only a temporary respite. Now she would have to face the consequences of putting her own needs ahead of institutional expectations. The police cars arrived within minutes of each other, their presence seeming almost aggressive in the peaceful Highland setting. Detective Inspector Collins stepped out of the lead vehicle, her relief at finding the Queen safe visible despite her professional demeanor. "Your Majesty," Collins said, approaching carefully. "Are you injured? Are you here voluntarily?" Camilla smiled sadly at the formal address. After a day and night of simply being herself, the return to royal protocol felt jarring. "I'm fine, Inspector. I'm here by choice. I apologize for the concern I've caused." Collins radioed immediately to London that the Queen had been found safe and appeared to be unharmed. The news reached King Charles within minutes, and his relief was audible even over the secure phone connection. Palace officials began implementing plans for managing the media response to this unprecedented incident. As Camilla gathered her belongings, she handled her 2 precious bags with special care. The letters and photographs inside represented more than personal mementos. They were reminders of who she was beneath the titles and expectations. She had come here to remember that woman, and despite the brief nature of her stay, she felt she had accomplished something important. The journey back to London would be different from her secret departure. This time, there would be security escorts, official vehicles, and the inevitable return to a life where every movement was watched and analyzed. But she was returning with a clearer sense of herself, and a renewed understanding of why her public role mattered. Looking back at the cottage one last time before entering the police car, Camilla felt grateful for these few hours of peace. She had remembered who she was before the crown, and that memory would help her wear it with greater authenticity in the days to come. The contents of her bags, letters from ordinary people and photographs of her authentic self, would remind her that being queen meant serving others while remaining true to the woman she had always been. The return journey to London was a stark contrast to Camilla's peaceful departure. A convoy of police vehicles surrounded her car, while helicopters maintained aerial surveillance. The woman who had left the capital seeking anonymity was returning with more attention than she had ever wanted. Detective Inspector Collins sat beside Camilla in the secure vehicle, studying the Queen with professional curiosity and personal concern. This was unlike any case she had handled. A missing person who hadn't really been missing, a security breach that wasn't actually a breach, a crisis that revealed more about institutional pressures than criminal activity. "Your Majesty," Collins said carefully, "I need to understand what happened. For our report, the resources that were deployed, the international implications, there will be questions that need answers." Camilla looked out at the Scottish countryside passing by the window. "I needed to remember who I was," she said simply, "before I could continue being who I'm supposed to be." The explanation seemed both entirely reasonable and completely inadequate to Collins. She understood human needs for solitude and reflection, but the Queen's responsibilities extended far beyond personal comfort, the precedent being set that senior royals could simply disappear when feeling overwhelmed had implications that troubled security professionals and constitutional experts alike. Word of Camilla's safe recovery had reached news organizations, but details remained tightly controlled. Palace communications teams were working frantically to craft a narrative that would minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation while acknowledging the unusual circumstances. Early reports described as security precaution and planned movement without revealing the true nature of the Queen's unauthorized departure. King Charles was pacing the private quarters of Clarence House when updates about the return journey reached him. His relief at Camilla's safety was complicated by confusion about her motivations and concern about the public relations implications. In his decades of preparation for kingship, no one had prepared him for the possibility that the pressures of royal life might overwhelm his partner. Margaret, Camilla's assistant, was facing intense questioning about her role in facilitating the Queen's departure. Her loyalty to Camilla was absolute, but she was beginning to understand the broader implications of their secret planning. The trust that existed between royals and their staff depended on preventing exactly this kind of situation. She wasn't running away permanently, Margaret insisted to the investigators. She just needed space to think. The criticism has been relentless lately, and she's human. She has limits like everyone else. This explanation highlighted an uncomfortable truth about modern monarchy, the expectation that public figures would absorb unlimited criticism and maintain perfect composure under all circumstances. The old model of royalty, protected by deference and distance, had given way to celebrity-style scrutiny that few humans could endure indefinitely. As the convoy approached the outskirts of London, Camilla opened one of her precious bags and pulled out a letter from a young mother in Liverpool. The woman had written after Camilla visited her child's hospital ward, describing how the Queen's attention had given hope during the darkest period of her son's illness. The letter was worn from multiple readings, a reminder of why public service mattered despite its personal costs. "Inspector," Camilla said, looking up from the letter, "do you understand why this happened?" Collins considered her response carefully. "I think I'm beginning to understand, Your Majesty. The pressure must be enormous." "Not the pressure," Camilla corrected gently. "The distance. When you're always performing, always being watched and judged, you start to lose track of the person you're performing as. I went to Scotland to find her again." The convoy was entering London's suburbs now, passing through neighborhoods where people were going about their normal Tuesday afternoon activities. Children walked home from school. People queued at bus stops. Shop owners swept their doorways. All the ordinary activities of life that Camilla rarely experienced without official purpose or media. Attention. Palace officials were preparing for Camilla's return with military precision. Secure routes had been planned, medical teams were on standby despite assurances of her good health, and communication strategies were being refined based on the latest media monitoring reports. Prime Minister's office had been kept informed throughout the crisis, and there were difficult conversations ahead about the constitutional implications of the Queen's actions. While no laws had been broken, the precedent of a senior royal simply disappearing raised questions about the stability and reliability of the monarchy as an institution. International allies had also been quietly informed that the situation was resolved. The brief period when the Queen's location was unknown had triggered security protocols in allied nations, reflecting the global implications of British royal family stability. As the convoy reached central London, Camilla could see the familiar landmarks that defined her public life: Buckingham Palace, Westminster, the government buildings where she regularly fulfilled ceremonial duties. The sight of these places triggered a complex mix of emotions: duty and resentment, pride and burden, belonging and alienation. Her phone, which she had kept turned off during her retreat, now showed dozens of missed messages. Family members, friends, palace officials, and charitable organizations had all tried to reach her. Each missed call represented someone who depended on her availability, someone whose needs had been put aside during her brief escape. Detective Inspector Collins was already composing her report mentally. This case would be studied by security professionals for years, analyzed for lessons about protecting public figures who might be struggling with personal challenges. The traditional model of royal protection focused on external threats, but Camilla's disappearance highlighted the need to understand internal pressures as well. "Your Majesty," Collins said as they approached Clarence House, "there will be debriefings, reviews of procedures, changes to protocols. This can't happen again." Camilla nodded, understanding the institutional perspective, while also knowing that the personal struggles that had driven her to Scotland hadn't been resolved by her brief retreat. "I understand, Inspector, but I hope you understand too. Sometimes the biggest threat to someone in my position isn't external. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of your sense of self." The convoy was slowing now, approaching the secured entrance to Clarence House. Media vehicles were already gathering, their crews alerted by the unusual security activity. Within hours, the story would dominate news cycles around the world, generating analysis and commentary about everything from royal marriages to the mental health challenges of public life. Camilla clutched her bags tighter as they approached the familiar gates. Inside were letters from people whose lives she had touched, photographs of the woman she had been before crowns and protocols changed everything. These items had sustained her through her darkest moments and would continue to remind her of what mattered most about her role. The gates of Clarence House opened to receive her, but Camilla knew that the real challenge wasn't returning to the palace. It was returning to public life with the self-knowledge she had rediscovered in the Scottish Highlands. The gates of Clarence House closed behind the convoy with a finality that Camilla felt in her bones. After 36 hours of freedom, she was back in the golden cage that was royal life. King Charles was waiting in the private entrance, his face a mixture of relief, confusion, and barely contained emotion. Their embrace was watched by security personnel, palace staff, and the ever-present cameras that documented every moment of royal existence. But for a few seconds they were simply a husband and wife reunited after a crisis that had tested their relationship in ways neither had anticipated. "Camilla," Charles said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you talk to me?" She looked into his eyes, seeing the hurt and bewilderment there. "Because you would have tried to fix it, and this wasn't something that could be fixed by anyone but me." Inside the private quarters, away from watching eyes, Camilla set down her 2 worn leather bags on the familiar antique table. These bags, which had seemed so important during her escape, now looked small and ordinary in the grand surroundings of royal residence. But their contents remained precious: letters, photographs, and memories that had reminded her of who she was beneath the crown. Charles examined the bags with curiosity, finally understanding that whatever his wife had taken with her was more significant than jewels or official documents. "What did you carry with you?" he asked gently. Camilla opened the first bag and pulled out a handful of letters. "These," she said, spreading them on the table. "Letters from people whose lives we've touched. Reminders of why this all matters." Charles picked up one of the letters, recognizing the handwriting of his stepson. The young man had written during the worst period of media attacks on Camilla, offering support and understanding that had kept her going through dark days. Another letter was from an elderly veteran who had thanked Camilla for visiting his care home, describing how her attention had made him feel valued and remembered. "I forgot," Camilla said quietly. "In all the criticism and protocol and pressure, I forgot that real people are affected by what we do. I went to Scotland to remember." The second bag contained photographs that chronicled a life lived before royal duties transformed everything. Pictures of Camilla laughing in gardens, cooking for friends, enjoying simple pleasures that had become impossible once every public appearance was scrutinized and analyzed. Charles studied these images of the woman he had fallen in love with, recognizing qualities that palace life had gradually obscured. Margaret knocked softly on the door, carrying tea and the inevitable stack of urgent messages that had accumulated during the crisis. Her face showed the strain of the past 36 hours, during which she had been questioned, criticized, and forced to defend her loyalty to Camilla while acknowledging her role in the unauthorized departure. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, setting down the tea service with unusual formality, "the palace communications team needs to speak with you about the press response. There are also calls from your children, the Prime Minister's office, and several charitable organizations." Camilla nodded, understanding that the practical consequences of her actions were just beginning. The story was already spreading through international media, with headlines ranging from sympathetic to sensational. Royal correspondents were analyzing every detail, searching for deeper meanings and broader implications. Detective Inspector Collins arrived for the mandatory debriefing session, carrying files that would document this unprecedented incident for future security protocols. Her report would influence how royal protection operated for decades to come, examining both the failures that allowed the Queen to disappear and the success in locating her safely. "Your Majesty," Collins began, "I need to understand your thought process for the official record. The decision to leave without informing security put many people at risk." Camilla looked at the detective with new respect, recognizing someone who had worked tirelessly to ensure her safety, despite personal confusion about the situation. "Inspector, I understand the protocols exist for good reasons, but sometimes those same protocols become prisons that trap the people they're meant to protect." The debriefing session lasted several hours, covering every aspect of Camilla's departure and return. Security vulnerabilities were identified and addressed. Communication procedures were reviewed and modified, and new protocols were established for handling similar situations in the future. As evening approached, Charles and Camilla found themselves alone again in their private quarters. The immediate crisis had passed, but the underlying issues that had driven her to Scotland remained unresolved. The constant scrutiny, the pressure to be perfect, the challenge of maintaining authenticity while fulfilling institutional roles. These problems hadn't disappeared during her brief retreat. What happens now? Charles asked, genuinely uncertain about how they would move forward. Camilla walked to the window, looking out at the London streets where ordinary people lived ordinary lives without constant observation and judgment. Now I try to be better at being queen because I remember why it matters, she said. And I keep these letters close to remind me when I forget again. Over the following days, the media coverage of Camilla's disappearance evolved from sensational headlines to more thoughtful analysis of the pressures facing modern royalty. Mental health advocates praised her for highlighting the human cost of public service, while constitutional experts debated the implications of senior royals prioritizing personal needs over institutional duties. The bags that had contained her most precious possessions were placed in a secure drawer in her private study, but their contents continued to influence her daily decisions. Letters from grateful citizens were displayed where she could see them during difficult moments. Photographs of her authentic self served as reminders of the woman beneath the crown. 3 months later, during a visit to a children's hospital, Camilla received another letter that would join her collection. A young mother wrote to thank her for the genuine compassion she had shown during a difficult time, noting that the Queen seemed more present and authentic than in previous public appearances. Reading that letter, Camilla smiled with genuine satisfaction. Her brief escape to Scotland hadn't solved all the challenges of royal life, but it had reminded her of what mattered most. She was still queen with all the burdens and responsibilities that title carried, but she was also still the woman who could find joy in simple gardens, meaning in personal connections, and strength in remembering that beneath every crown is a human heart, theUK. Bags that had shocked everyone by their modest contents had revealed the most important truth about modern monarchy, that titles and positions are temporary, but the person who wears them must remain genuine to serve others effectively. Camilla had returned from Scotland not as a different queen, but as a more authentic one, carrying with her the letters and memories that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead.